As we know, being a gamer is an expensive business. Regardless of whether you're a console or a PC player, it seems like the cost of both games and hardware just keeps going up and up. With both the PS5 and the Xbox Series X setting players back almost $500, it feels like we're getting to the point where we need to remortgage our homes to keep up with the latest tech, or at least we could do that if we could actually afford a home. But have you ever stopped to wonder which console is the most expensive ever? We have, and so for today's list we've taken a look back through the archives to find the priciest consoles ever released. However, rather than going by their cost at launch, we've looked at the original retail cost of every major console and then run them through an inflation calculator to give us an idea of how much they would cost us today. After all, a console that costs $500 these days is actually relatively cheaper than a console that costs $500 in the 90s, you know, because of the economy and such. With all of that nice and clear, I'm the bargain-priced Ben from TripleJump, and here are the 10 most expensive consoles of all time. Number 10. Xbox One X, $499 or $606.67 today. Sometimes a console will launch that's the best thing since sliced bread. Other times a console will launch that needs some refinement, and that's how we ended up with the Xbox One X. Teased at E3 2016 under the name Project Scorpio, the Xbox One X was released in November 2017 and boasted a number of improvements over its predecessor, the Xbox One. The console had 1TB of internal storage, 12GB of RAM, of which 9GB was allocated to games, and was designed to render games in 4K. It was fully compatible with all previously released Xbox One titles, as well as the backwards compatible Xbox and 360 games that were available on the One. Additionally, some games were optimized for the console, giving players a superior graphical experience. Put simply, the Xbox One X was superior to the Xbox One and, according to Phil Spencer, Sony's PlayStation 4 Pro in every way. However, perhaps its biggest selling point was that it was the exact same price as the original Xbox One, and whilst it didn't come with a Kinect, it did have a whole host of features that were far more useful than the ill-fated peripheral. Number 9. Xbox One, $499 or $638.35 today. Here's a fun fact, not only was the original Xbox One not quite as good as the Xbox One X, but when adjusted for inflation, it was also technically more expensive. When it was initially unveiled, there was a good bit of controversy surrounding the Xbox One. In the following months, Microsoft ended up backpedaling on a number of announcements relating to the console, including the requirement for regular online check-ins and restrictions on game sharing and used games. Despite getting off to a rough start, Microsoft's 8th generation console went down fairly well with both critics and players when it was finally released, with many praising the premium feel of the controller, improved reliability of the One over the 360, Red Ring of Death Who, and the console's inoffensive design. Sadly, a decent reception didn't end up translating to great sales, and it's estimated that for every Xbox One sold, Sony shifted 2 PS4s. This was due in part to all of Microsoft's U-turns, a lack of exclusives, and of course, the price, as the console cost a whopping $100 more than its biggest competitor, the PlayStation 4. Sure, it came with a Kinect, but let's face it, no one really wanted that, did they? Number 8. Magnavox Odyssey, $99 or $705.82 today. You might take a look at a price point like $99 and think, that's pretty reasonable for a console. It turns out though that if it were to go on sale today, the Magnavox Odyssey would cost way more than anything that's currently on the market. In fact, you could grab yourself an Xbox Series X and a Nintendo Switch Lite and still have enough money left over for a coffee. Released in 1972, the Magnavox Odyssey was the first commercially available home console and was capable of displaying such graphical marvels as up to 3 dots and a line of any length. Alright, it might not sound like much now, but at the time it was really exciting stuff. The Magnavox Odyssey retailed for $99, which is roughly $705 in 2022. This might seem kind of steep for a machine that does next to nothing, but the Magnavox Odyssey was a pioneer of the industry and paved the way for modern consoles. It's also probably worth noting that in its first 12 months on shelves, the Magnavox Odyssey shifted 69,000 units, which I think we can all agree is very nice. Number 7. PlayStation 3. $499/$599 or $734.64/$885.46 today. The PlayStation 3 is considered by many to be the black sheep of the PlayStation family. Unlike both its predecessors and its successors, the PS3 got off to a bit of a shaky start in life, and due to a number of factors including its high price point, which we'll get to, it took a while for the console to find its feet. The biggest issue with the PS3 was the fact that its complex architecture made it difficult to program for, and as such, a number of studios found it challenging to develop games for the console. As a result, it took a while for players to flock to the PS3, and despite Sony turning the system around and it ultimately outselling the Xbox 360, both the 360 and the Nintendo Wii were a good bit cheaper at launch. When it was released in 2006, the PS3 had two different price points. The version with 20GB of internal storage set consumers back $499, and the version with 60GB cost an eye-watering $599. That console would have been pretty pricey if released at these costs today, but when you realise that when adjusted for inflation they'd actually run $737 and $885 respectively, suddenly that PlayStation 5 doesn't look like such a terrible deal. Number 6. Sega Saturn, $399, or $780.23 today. We all remember the iconic moment that then Sony president Steve Race took to the lectern at E3 1995, calmly placed down his papers and said nothing more into the mic than $299, undermining everything that then Sega CEO Tom Kalinske had to say about the Sega Saturn. For those wondering, the PlayStation went on to outsell the Saturn by about 10-1, due in large part to the fact that it was a great deal cheaper. Still, the Saturn wasn't without its virtues, and if you were the sort of person who was looking for a decent library of games, including more arcade ports than you could shake a stick at, then it was a sound investment. The Saturn was also home to a number of exclusives that are now considered classics, including the likes of Panzer Dragoon, Nights into Dreams, and Virtua Fighter, none of which could be found on any other console. Still, for the average gamer, the machine just wasn't worth shelling out for, and when you consider that the PlayStation did much the same as the Saturn for only 3/4 of the price, there's little wonder that consumers flocked in their tens of millions to Sony's little grey box. Number 5. Atari 5200, $830.73 today. The 80s was a rough time for a lot of people, what with the Cold War, the Chernobyl disaster, and having to wear your hair like this. As if to add insult to injury, it was during this decade that the games industry decided to go to plops as well. 5 years after the release of the Atari 2600, don't worry, we haven't forgotten about that, Atari launched the 5200, a console which, if my maths is right, should have been twice as good as its predecessor. It wasn't. The actual hardware was almost identical to that found in Atari's 8-bit computers, and unlike its biggest competitor, the ColecoVision, which came with Donkey Kong packed in, the 5200 came with Super Breakout, which had previously been released for the 2600. The Atari 5200 was ultimately discontinued in 1984 after just 2 years on the market, its sales having fallen far short of expectations. In fact, only around 1 million consoles were ever sold, which was likely due to the fact that it barely had any games and was, for a piece of hardware at the time, so gosh darned expensive. Anyway, whilst we're on the subject of Atari. Number 4. Atari 2600, $199, or $978.62 today. Although it's only placed 4th on our list today, in some ways you could say that the Atari 2600 was the most expensive console ever made. After all, not only was its retail price somewhat steep, but it almost killed the games industry. Okay, fine, it was the decisions of Atari themselves in regards to the 2600 that nearly killed the industry, but you know, potato, potato. Originally branded as the Atari Video Computer System, the console was released in 1977 alongside 9 launch titles, including the pack-in game Combat. Sadly, most people have forgotten about the great games that were released for the 2600 due to the 2 very famous bad ones, E.T. the Extraterrestrial and Pac-Man. Funnily enough, Pac-Man went on to be the best-selling title for the 2600, but it was so awful that it eroded consumers' confidence in the industry as a whole and was responsible, in part, for the crash of '83. Oh, and we haven't even touched on how ugly it is. What was it about the 70s that made people want wood on their electronics? If the Atari 2600 were to go on sale in 2022, it would set gamers back the best part of $1,000 and would likely set the games industry back about a decade. Number 3. Intellivision, $299, or $1,081.38 today. Ooh, we're getting into the real big bucks now. The Intellivision, whose name just so happens to be a portmanteau of the words intelligent and television, was released by Mattel Electronics in 1979 and was intended to be a competitor to the Atari 2600. Although it was a pricey bit of kit, there's a number of good reasons for its cost, as under that little black and cream hood was a great deal of innovation. It can be considered to be the first 16-bit console as it came with a 16-bit microprocessor. It was the first console to allow players to download games thanks to the Play cable, which launched in 1981. Plus, the IntelliVoice module allowed players to hear real human voices in video games for the first time ever. When this wonderful little machine launched, it set players back a whopping $299, which when adjusted for inflation would be well over $1,000 in today's money. Despite costing an arm and a leg between 1980 and 1983, over 3 million Intellivisions were sold, and considering just how much it pushed the envelope, there's little wonder that people were so willing to part with their hard-earned cash for one. Number 2. Neo Geo AES, $649, or $1,420 blaze it and 4 cents today. We're sticking with innovative consoles for the moment, and whilst the level of innovation on display in the Neo Geo wasn't a patch on the Intellivision, it gave the world one of the most important technological advancements in gaming history: the removable memory card. Was this leap forward worth the cost of admission though? The jury is out on that one. The Neo Geo was originally launched as a coin-operated arcade machine in 1990, with the home console version, the Neo Geo AES, making its way into players' living rooms in 1991. At the time, it was the most powerful console ever made, but unless you were into fighting games and had a boatload of disposable income, then the Neo Geo probably wouldn't have been for you. The AES was originally released for rental only in Japan, as SNK Corporation, the company behind the console, felt that it was too expensive for consumers. Just a year after its rental launch though, they threw caution to the wind and the Neo Geo AES went on sale for a staggering $649, which equates to $1,420, blaze it, dollars in today's money. Unsurprisingly, it's hard to find anyone these days that actually owned one. Number 1. 3DO, $699, or $1,441.59 today. Even in today's market, a company charging $699 for a console would raise some eyebrows, so imagine how horrified gamers in the early 90s felt when they learned just how much the 3DO was retailing for. Unlike the other systems on this list, the 3DO was not a single console, but rather a series of specifications that went on to be manufactured by the likes of Panasonic, Gold Star, or LG if you want to get more up-to-date name about this, and Sanyo. Although the 3DO's technical specs were impressive, critics and players failed to warm to it, and so despite making leaps forward in the graphics, sound, and game design departments, it won few fans. The 3DO's problems were several-fold. Firstly, it had very few exclusives, so there was no real reason for consumers to choose it over its competitors. Secondly, there were far cheaper alternatives out there already, plus more on the way. And finally, its retail cost was eye-watering. Considering the fact that in 1993, when the 3DO was launched, you could take your $700 to your local game store and buy both an SNES and a Sega Genesis and still have change, it's really no surprise that only about 2 million people ever bought the 3DO.